Okay, I think we'll start. There are obviously a few people. Oh, there's a few people upstairs as well. There are obviously some people delayed in the museum, which is not a bad thing, of course. As museum director, I should be happy about that. I hope that everybody enjoyed the morning session. In a sense, I realise we're now going for the more internationalist, if I can say that, or at least global perspective to some extent. Having had 3 of the first 4 speakers in the conference being from the former Soviet Union, we're now looking at artists and one theorist who are not from that region, but nevertheless engaged and involved in what it produced. As I say, one of the important things was to mix the sort of tone of voice between the artist and the theorist. And in the afternoon session, we have 2 artists, but we start. It's really with great pleasure that for the first time I can welcome Clare Bishop to the Abbemuseum. And I hope, again, it really won't be the last. She is involved in the former West project on a more structural level, but also is somebody that I personally greatly admire and has helped a lot in my thinking around questions of contemporary art and relational aesthetics and engagement and things like that. So it's really a great pleasure to have her here. She is an art historian and critic, I suppose that goes without saying, and is based in the History of Art department at the City University of New York Graduate Center in New York City. Previously, Bishop was an associate professor in the Department of Art History at the University of Warwick, Coventry, England, and a visiting professor at the Royal College of Art. Bishop is editor of the highly regarded volumes Participation, published by the Whitechapel Gallery in London, and Installation Art, a Critical History from 2005, and is a contributor to many art journals, including Art Forum, October, and hopefully After All sometime soon. Her essay, Antagonism in Relational Aesthetics, appeared in October in 2004. Gosh, it's quite a time ago now, and was really a fundamental and very influential first critique of what's termed, perhaps rather something of a misnomer in some ways, but termed relational aesthetics, and the series of practices around that term. Bishop is currently working on a history and theory of socially engaged art, which will be published by Verso next year. So, Claire, if I could ask you to come to the stage. Thanks.
Thank you for that very generous introduction. Hello, everyone. And hello to people on webcast, including, I hope, my mum. Happy Mother's Day. Right, okay. So as you can see by my title, maybe I'm trying to respond to Boris Groys. And to try and, I find his conclusions depressing, really. So I want to, but without being, blithely upbeat about it, maybe just to provide a different context to the kind of propositions he's putting forward. I also worry that what I'm saying is crushingly obvious and a bit boring, so apologies about it. Maybe I've just been looking at this stuff too long and it's time to move somewhere else. But okay, so I wanted to begin this by saying, which Soviet avant-garde? I mean, that's something that Boris problematized last night and which has come up again today. So in fact, I'm going to be leaving the complexity of the Soviet avant-garde behind and looking at it through the most influential filter in the West, which is Walter Benjamin. But the strand I want to pick up on today is the idea of mass creativity, which has been given its inimitable Boycean branding in the phrase, everyone is an artist. But before being made famous by Beuys, the dream that everyone is an artist can be found in the early writing of Marx, for whom self-realization through creative activity stood as the opposite of alienation. In the German Ideology, from 1845 to 6, Marx and Engels argue that the only thing that stops everyone being an artist is the fact that art, like all other professions, is subject to the division of labor. They note that the exclusive concentration of artistic talent in particular individuals is inseparable from other forms of capitalist specialization. Famously, they anticipated that in a future communist society, there'd be no subordination of the artist to medium-specific specialization, i.e. being a painter, a sculptor, a photographer, and so on. And then most importantly, there would be, quote, no painters, but at most people who engage in painting among other activities. In a well-known passage in the same text, Marx and Engels claim that as long as work remains compulsory, rather than voluntary, man will be a prisoner of an exclusive sphere of activity. And I'm going to read you the most famous quote that epitomizes this, which I always find rather amusing. and I begin, he is a hunter, a fisherman, a shepherd, or a cultural critic, and must remain so if he does not want to lose his means of livelihood. While in communist society, when nobody has one exclusive sphere of activity, but each can become accomplished in any branch he wishes, society regulates the general production and thus makes it possible for me to do one thing today and another tomorrow. To hunt in the morning, to fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, criticize after dinner, just as I have a mind, without ever becoming a hunter, a fisherman, a cowherd, or a critic. Now, however fanciful this vision of non-specialist creative activity, the image of freedom that it presents has been a compelling ideal throughout the 20th century, recurring especially at moments of political upheaval, in the wake of the 1917 revolution, in the aftermath of 1968, and more recently, but also I think quite differently, in the wake of 1989. So rather than try and find a direct correlate for this idea in one of the many forms of Soviet avant-garde, whose factions are notoriously divided and complex, I'm going to take as the epitome of this sentiment Walter Benjamin's well-known essay, The Author as Producer, which was informed by his trip to Moscow in 1926-7. In this essay, Benjamin famously argues that a work of art is better the more readers or audiences it turns into collaborators. But to be correct here, we should notice that Benjamin doesn't use the phrase work of art, he uses apparatus, the German word Apparat. Benjamin has already moved away from the idea of the work of art as a repository of auratic cult value and towards the idea of mass reproducible technology that reaches an optimum number of people and allows them to participate in creatively determining its content. So this is the key quote where he puts forward this claim. A writer who doesn't reach other writers teaches nobody. The crucial point, therefore, is that a writer's production must have the character of a model. It must be able to instruct other writers in their production, and secondly, it must be able to place an improved apparatus at their disposal. This apparatus will be the better, the more consumers it brings into contact with the production process. In short, the more readers or spectators it turns into collaborators. Yeah, so this is the essence of the kind of the politics of participation as read at that time. So when Benjamin's essay was translated into English in 1970, it lent immediate weight to a generation seeking to challenge authority and effect cultural reform. It impacted on the community arts movement in particular, which attempted to reformulate the role of the artist from a singular producer to the facilitator of others' creativity, be this through participatory theatre, music, visual art, and so on. Its consequences were enormous in opening up recognition for and funding streams for amateur creativity at a time when public funding was administered by the upper classes and directed primarily towards opera, ballet, and the National Theatre. Today, Benjamin's essay continues to be widely cited in discussions around participatory and socially engaged art. There's a widespread consensus that an art project is better the more people it turns into collaborators. In the wake of Flickr, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter, this dream of a multi-authored technological apparatus seems to have become true. As Boris Groys would argue, today everyone really is an artist. But when we consider this vision of lay creativity today, I think there are several stumbling blocks to the viability of this claim. The most obvious is the issue of quality, which a few people have started to bring up already this morning, notably Ekaterina. To what extent is the democratizing force of mass participation compatible with content that's worth paying attention to? Everyone is creative, but is there an audience for this creativity? So back to the question of spectatorship that I asked Boris last night. And you know, Boris has already written, of course, about the fact that if everybody is in a producer, there are no more spectators. It's a myth that we still live in a society of the spectacle. Secondly, I would like to suggest that there's a difference between creativity and art. There's a fundamental difference, I think, between creativity as the capacity of many and art as the skill of a few. And this distinction goes back to the Russian avant-garde. Искусство, or art, was the term rejected by prolix cult theorists in favour of, apologies for my pronunciation here, tvorчество, or creativity. Since the 1990s, it's creativity and not art that has been one of the major buzzwords of the new economy. Although art is important for the creative industries, it's only one of many activities that are seen to have economic stimulus in the wake of heavy industry. The others include music, publishing, films, games, advertising, fashion, design, TV and radio, all of which have obvious commercial potential. Now, to bring this back to our local context, in 2005, for example, a policy document called Our Creative Capacity was presented to the Dutch right-wing coalition government by the Ministry of Education, Culture and Science and the Ministry of Economic Affairs. The paper's aim was to boost the economic potential of culture and creativity by operating on two fronts. Firstly, giving the business community more insight into the possibilities offered by the creative sector, and secondly, encouraging the cultural sector to have greater awareness of its market potential. In the same document, we find that its authors acknowledge no difference between creative industry, the culture industry, art, and entertainment. What results from this elision is not a productive blurring and complication of all of these terms, as we might hope to find in certain contemporary art practices, but rather the reduction of everything to a matter of finance. In 2006, Amsterdam City Council began an aggressive rebranding of the Dutch capital as a creative city. And I quote, "Creativity will be the central focus point," it claimed, since creativity is the motor that gives the city its magnetism and dynamism. One of the models for the Dutch initiative is the British government. Since succeeding to power in 1997, New Labour has placed an emphasis on the role of creativity and culture for growth in what they call the knowledge economy. This includes museums as a source of local regeneration, but also investment in the creative industries as alternatives to traditional manufacturing. New Labour has adopted a far more openly instrumental approach to cultural policy than previous British governments, and this is extended to intervening in the national curriculum to facilitate the development of creativity within schools as a subject that's equal to literacy and numeracy. A 2001 Green Paper opens with the words, "Everyone is creative," presenting the government's mission as one that aims to, quote, "free the collective potential of individuals," end quote. This aim of unleashing creativity, however, is not directed towards greater social happiness or the realization of authentic human potential or the imagination of utopian alternatives, but rather, in the words of sociologist Andrew McRobbie, to, and I quote, "produce a future generation of socially diverse creative workers who are brimming with ideas and whose skills need not only be channeled into the fields of art and culture, but will also be good for business. Most importantly, these will be self-standing or self-sufficient individuals whose efforts will not be hindered by the administrations of the state," end quote. So it becomes important to develop creativity in schools, not because everyone must be an artist, but because everyone is increasingly required to assume the individualization associated with the artistic lifestyle, to embrace risk, look after our self-interest, be our own brands, and be free of dependency from the state. In other words, Boris's dystopian realization of the historic avant-garde. A similar point has been argued by Andrew Ross in his study of dot-com culture, No Collar, from 2003. The artist has become the role model for a precarious workforce, since the artist has a work mentality based on flexibility, i.e. you work project by project rather than 9 to 5, and the artist is The question of who the participants of this project are is also more oblique than Alfredo Yar's direct search for the more immediate neighbours of the museum. Since Colin's project requires people to submit rolls of film, it engages a sector of the public that don't yet have access to digital cameras. He turns their images into a slideshow, reinforcing the work's meditation on obsolescent technology, as well as shifting an intimate mode of image making into public display. Today, many of us have digital cameras and instantly edit our lives. Film photography requires a delay and the embarrassment of having people, i.e. the film developers, seeing your pictures before you do. So although Camera Lucida and Free Photo Lab are both projects that draw on lay creativity, they have different ambitions. For Alfredo Yar, this is a social process attempting to demonstrably impact upon the museum's identity. However, it does this through conventional, even cliched means of artistic presentation. Collins aims to reflect on photography as a medium, but through people's collaboration, he extends this to a commentary on class and on the dynamics of collaboration itself. Free Photo Lab is more voyeuristic, more unfair, more medium reflexive, and as such, a great deal less affirmative as a social position, even if, like Camera Lucida, it still depends for its authenticity on showing poorer people's lives unmediated by the artist's presence. This was reflected in tone and methodology. Colin's images have a through line in terms of a visual sensibility, choosing images that the photographers may not have chosen for themselves. Alfredo Yar's participants, by contrast, have the opportunity to self-censor. If Yar presents himself as a saintly intercessor, Collins speaks honestly about the awkward economy between artist and subjects. And I'm going to read you a little section of an interview where he speaks about this. He says, "And I gamble that the most compromised, barbed, and problematic exchanges are the ones which you might best respond to, the rules of the game. The offering up of the self, not in a utopian fashion, not in a collective experience, but in a way which readily understands the self-consciousness of our relationships, the highly individualized awkwardness, and its grim exploitation. This relationship is one predicated on trespass and unction, the ignoble, the desperate, our inability to connect without the troubling presence of a filter or a reason." End quote. So I think you can probably see the problem I'm starting to frame. In the old Benjaminian formula, the apparatus is primary. The content produced by this apparatus is secondary. In fact, it's not really important at all. In Collins' model, by contrast, there's scope for exploring other dynamics, such as perversity and exploitation. These become a means to produce a reflection not just on the changing status of how we perceive and experience a particular medium, in this case photography, but also on the relationship between the artist and his or her collaborators and participants. So I've got another pair as well. I'm going to move more quickly through these. My second pair of examples begins with the Danish collective Superflex, who've been working together since 1995. The main publication documenting their work is an open source book called Tools, indicating the extent to which the group's practice revolves around the idea of an apparatus for use and participation, rather than of objects to be contemplated. One of their best-known projects is an internet television station to be used by communities as a trigger for social bonding. Under the title of Tenant Spin, one version of this project was installed for use by pensioners in an housing estate in Liverpool as part of the city's first biennial. Other versions have been set up in galleries in Milan, Edinburgh, New York, Sharjah, Leipzig, and Chiang Mai. The images relating to this project are casual. One of my students compared them to illustrations in a sociology textbook, and show the kind of social situations in which the work was produced, as well as Superflex's dot-com aesthetic in the use of orange, a chunky font, and the embrace of new technology. As with Alfredo Yar's Camera Lucida, the actual content of the internet TV programs is less important than the apparatus that Superflex have devised, and the fact that it allows a great number of people to be creative and to socialize. Critical responses to this work reinforce my impression that this is the case, as, to my knowledge, no writers have commented on the TV programs actually produced. Rather, they focus on the social context and the improved social dynamic that Superflex hoped to result from this intervention. So we can compare Superflex's apparatus for everyday creativity to the folk archive set up by the British artists Jeremy Deller and Alan Kane in 1999. God, it's 11 years ago now. I mean, these projects have been going a long time. Okay, so the folk archive is a collection of materials celebrating amateur creativity. When exhibited, the archive includes photos and videos of festivals and demonstrations, alongside objects borrowed from their owners, such as Snowdrop the mechanical elephant, on loan from the Clare family in Cumbria. The archive also includes a subsection of prison art and prisoners' interventions and political banners made by Ed Hall in South London. As a totality, the archive serves to redefine folk as a class of contemporary visual culture, rather than the rural traditions conventionally evoked by this term, although these are, of course, included as well. Around a third of the archive is distinctively urban, featuring tropical nail designs, graffiti, fake parking tickets, elaborately customized cars, and novel floral tributes, such as this one, a cigarette floral tribute. Although the overall selection varies wildly and is deeply inconsistent, Kane and Deller's eccentric attempt to reimagine the category of folk cuts across the conventional horizons of cultural attention, presenting an extravagant, lewd, and comic alternative to mass culture. Now, if Superflex seemed to target specific constituencies as the recipients of Super Channel, the elderly, teenagers, gallery goers, then the folk archive, I think, is less clearly definable, since its contributors link together urban and rural, working and middle class. It juxtaposes anonymous culture and contemporary art, and suggests that folk art has been equally, they connect folk art and contemporary art by suggesting that both have been equally responsive to recent social, technological and cultural changes, turning to performance and action, video and installation. Yeah? So I like very much the way he maps contemporary art categories onto folk art. So if Superflex become producers in the classic Benjaminian model, Deller and Kane become curators, reassessing what objects merit cultural attention and why. Significantly, I think, this is not undertaken as a reprise of postmodern eclecticism and the collapse of high and low. Rather, it's an enterprise that hinges entirely on the idiosyncratic eye of the artists and what they choose to include or not. So to my eyes, the Folk Archive stands, like Collins' Free Photo Lab, as a critique of many socially engaged projects of the 90s. For Deller, the most potent forms of self-organisation are those that are really self-organised, rather than mobilised by the artist. And I think this is reflected in the artist's apparent detachment from their objects, which often irritates a leftist audience, and in their role as mediators or curators of lay creativity. So the main difference then, I think, between the types of work I've been showing you lies in the changed role of the artist, not as a facilitator of other people's creativity in the 1970s model, but as a curatorial figure who finds already existing examples of other people's creativity and draws attention to these modes. Significantly, I think these objects and images are presented to us not as the byproduct of a model or apparatus, but as experiences in their own right. I should put this one back up again. So rather than contriving to facilitate lay creativity through an apparatus, artists find this creativity already existing in the world. It seems that only in this way, by adopting a curatorial method, can artists seemingly overcome the impossible gap between mass creativity and avant-gardism, two terms that I think are necessarily antithetical, since the avant-garde is by definition a small elite, the avant of a mainstream garde. In this model, then, art becomes a question not of the maker's institutional identity, i.e. whether or not these people, this florist, has an MFA and shows in Manifesta, nor of the inherent cultural value of these objects, which by themselves might not amount to very much, but rather it's a result of the complex system of representation in which a particular juxtaposition of objects and images is as important as the friction between the artist-curator's generosity on the one hand and exploitative perversity on the other. Such works seem to propose that the Benjaminian model of participation as production needs to be combined with another model from the historic avant-garde, the mental participation proposed by Marcel Duchamp in 1957. Working against the idea that looking equals consuming equals passivity, Duchamp proposed that spectators' work of deciphering and interpreting a work of art is itself a creative act, but not maybe a work of art.